I just introduced myself. Why don't you guys introduce yourself? Everyone knows who I am now.
Oh, you know you want to moderate. There's nobody behind you.
Are you talking to Dawn?
I am talking to Dawn, and she knows it, and she's just pleasantly. Dawn is being so Dawn. No, she's going to opt out. Hi, everybody. I'm Louis. I am the co-founder of Tidelift. We were just acquired by Sonar, and at Tidelift, we work on supporting open source maintainers, mostly of small projects that woke up one morning and realized, wait, the entire world economy depends on what we do. So we are not, we are a VC-backed startup, but most of our projects, unlike some of the ones that you were talking about in your talk, are individuals who are not VC-backed, who were scratching an itch and somehow accidentally stumbled into scratching an itch that the whole world has, right? And they woke up one morning with like, wait, Fortune 500 companies use my code? This surely is a mistake. So we support them. And personally, I'm a former programmer turned attorney, so I help build legal structures to support these kinds of things.
Well, Peter Zaitsev, I am a founder of Percona and co-founder of some other open source companies like Altinity and FaradayB, which you can also see here, as well as an open source observability startup called Karut. I'm also very actively involved in open source community and really act as advisor, mentor, investor in some of the open source projects.
So, I think we're supposed to be talking about license changes and the business impact that they can have. So,
what business?
Whose business?
Yes, whose business?
Whose business? So I think that's one of the interesting things to talk about. Obviously, like changing licenses can have an impact, obviously, for the company that is behind, that maintains the project, and then also for companies or individuals who use the project. Why don't we talk, though, I'm imagining that we're supposed to talk about both, from both sides.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can, I mean, this is a sort of obvious statement, right? But you almost can't separate the two, right? I mean, as you were saying, part of how you do this business of open source is, at least in theory, or the theory that we all had when we started doing some of this, right, is that you were doing this perhaps in partnership with the community and changing the license. I think this is a little overstated, but we often used to say in earlier days that the license is like a community constitution in some important ways. And when you're making a radical change to that constitution, it inevitably is changing your relationship to everybody, right? To your users, to your contributors. And so it's something that I think has to be done obviously pretty carefully, including, frankly, the honest question of, do I have contributors or do I just have users? And I think that's...
Yeah. Well, I think in this case it's interesting, right? And I think we have this general position, right, in this case. And if you look at a lot of companies who make a license change, right, they kind of say, well, guys, community contributors, we love you, but we have no choice, we have to do it. We didn't know it will come to that, but here we are, right? And I am maybe being kind of like a cynical son of bitch. See, we're different. Hey guys, you know what, you know how it plays out. You start a company and your intent is to get the free help from community when it suits you. Right? And finally, then you have a lot of adoption, enough money to buy the Super Bowl ads if you want to. Then you can say, well, screw you guys, thank you for all your help. Now we are going to switch from the adoption, which is the achieved best with open source license, especially more permissive open source licenses, to the monetization, which is best achieved with more restrictive licenses, maybe not going all the way that to the open source, right? And I'm sorry, in this case, I'm not just going to assume the good intent. right? My intent is, hey, well, that is understood. And why is that? Well, because it's actually very common VC's playbook. It's not only played in open source. Think about Uber. What is their business model? Well, we come to the city, we will provide the low-cost fares, then we'll run out the taxis and whatever out of business, and then we are going to jack it up and also jack up our share we are going to take from the drivers, right? That is a very common playbook. You subsidize something, you achieve dominance, and then that's when you get your commercial advantage from it.
So I would say, and definitely like speaking to some founders who have changed their license, who are not quite as big as I think the company that you're talking about. First of all, I think that they would all consider the license change as a type of failure, and I think that that's true. So I made that point about having to have enough differentiation between your product and your project to feel like they're not competing with each other. If you don't do that, eventually you're going to have to change your license. I think that that's just a reality. And sometimes the founder just can't, or the founders, the team, they just can't figure it out. And it's not necessarily because they're dumb. It's not necessarily because they're evil, but it's just because it's a hard problem. And it can definitely happen, I think, even more when you have a mature a mature project that works super well and that people take for granted, and that you can't figure out something that's sort of adjacent that you're going to commercialize.
Yeah.
I do think so often it ends up being a decision of, do we close down this company or do we change the license? And in that case, I honestly think changing the license is the way to go.
Well, and I would add something to that, right? I think a lot of you probably already got here. I'm not a big fan of lawyers, right, in this case. Well, with rare exceptions. But something I think what you need to know as a founder, right? It's not just, there is, saving this stuff, right? But if you get in the company, with a board, which you may be a member of, and all this kind of legal stuff, you may also have fiduciary fucking responsibilities. Right, so if you just say, well, I think for this kind of a world, it would be better to, to do other things, have maybe less revenue, less employees, but keep it open source, right? You may be actually putting yourself to a legal exposure, because the shareholders are saying, hey guys, how come? Why, instead of just, changing the license and maximizing the profits you can get, you are optimizing for, changing the difference in the world, right? Well, you can be getting a lot of trouble by doing that.
There's one.
Having just been a founder and just bought out, thankfully, this one I will defend the lawyers on, because well before you get to any legal liability, your board will fire you. Right? Like, this is not a question of your legal responsibilities. This is a question of your board of directors wants to see growth and profit. But I wanted to get back to something that you said earlier about that question of differentiating between project and product, right? And having something. I really think at least some of these relicensings that we're seeing are failures of creativity in how to do that segmentation, right?
Yep.
I think it's really interesting, for example, that Docker has really had a second lease on life, not so much by playing games around licensing, but by saying our client is proprietary. Like, they drew a line that they hadn't previously been able to draw, and that really got them to the point where they needed to be as a company, right? After a long time of sort of thrashing.
Yeah, I 100% agree about the failure of creativity. The thing that I wanted to mention, though, is that there's another thing when we talk about license shifts, and that is companies adopting licenses that are not open source, but calling them open source in their marketing. And this, I actually think, is not cool. That I can say 100% not cool. So for me, one of the things that I think that some of these companies are trying to do is try to make people think of open source as a spectrum, Like you have your permissive licenses that are more open source, and then you have your copyleft and they're a little bit less open source, and then you have this other stuff and it's a little bit less open source. So as if it was a spectrum. To me, that's actually not correct. It's a binary. So either you're open source or you are not. For me, the organization that sort of controls whether or not you're open source is the OSI. If you have an OSI approved license, it is an open source thing. If you don't, then you have some other kind of license. That is okay. Perhaps you are not evil, but own it. Don't say that this is an open source license.
Yes, well, Emily, I think that's also like where some of a problem lies, and I think that is sort of a failure of a leadership from a OSI, which says, oh, we focus on the open source stuff, and we don't care about what else expects, right? Like for a lot of people who say, hey, you know what, I want to reserve some of the rights, but I'm not going to be the Oracle kind of license, right? And says, how am I going to call it, right? I don't want to call it proprietary license because everybody thinks like that's like Oracle, right? Oh, and there is other choice, open source, right? We need a space to be that created. You know, hey, shared source license, whatever you want to call it, right? In this case, and I think that is the need in the market, right? That's a lot of stuff is going to be created in that space, right? But if you don't provide the language, right, and the definitions out there, those guys will be, choosing to call that open source.
To be fair to the OSI, I think that they can only do so many things. But I do agree that there does need to be a space that needs to be more well-defined between Oracle and MIT license.
So as a former OSI board member, long former OSI board member, I appreciate the patience of, OSI is a small nonprofit who ironically has a business model problem. And the latest wave of licenses literally was VC backed. Right, you literally had a large VC firm in Silicon Valley. It doesn't really matter which one, but it was one in particular. Telling their startups to call themselves open source and use non-open source licenses, right? And that's a real, and right now OSI is dealing with an even more vicious form of that, which is that Meta is running around Brussels and saying Llama is open source when I have my quibbles and concerns about the open source AI definition, but it is really, really, really clear that what Llama is doing is open source, and it is not a passive. I had been under the impression until fairly recently that was just Zuckerberg. Excuse my. Can we talk like adults in here? Talking out his ass. But the arse. Sorry. But in fact, his lobbyists are running around Brussels and DC saying, oh yeah, OSI is the old way of doing things. Like all of these restrictions that are clearly not open source are actually open source in the Brave New World as redefined by Mark. And by the way, when I say by Mark, I mean by Mark because my understanding from people within Facebook is that this is coming from the very top, because I guess he realized that maybe 3D virtual world with no legs was not really a thing, so now he's focusing on open instead.
It sort of goes to show how strong the brand of open source is. The fact that people are trying to corrupt it means that people care. I think the other thing, though, that this makes me think about is the brand behind open source as a term is really strong, but most people do not understand what open source actually means. And when I say most people, I'm not just talking about like a random person you stop on the street. I'm talking about software engineers who are professionals who you would probably assume know what open source is, but to them it's just something is on GitHub, it must be open source. So these things that we're talking about, like your random software engineer who is using all sorts of open source is probably not actually very savvy about is this an OSI approved license or not?
GitHub has 100 million users, and about 5/9 of them have no idea. Like, they think open source means I put it on GitHub, right? And that's not, I mean, talk about failures of OSI, right? Like, I think there's only so much you can do when a brand reaches that kind of takeoff, but like, we at OSI and more broadly in the open source movement, we just sort of thought that chanting the same mantra about the open source definition would be enough, and it clearly wasn't. And I think we missed a window of opportunity there.
Well, I would say something which is important, right? If an open source brand, we say correctly, this is an open source brand. But I think the problem is also what that is indefensible brand, right? Yes, we as our little community can choose and say, well, the only thing that open source is what the OSI says is open source, right? But if Mark chooses to call something else open source, right, and I choose to call something else open source, well, you can't do much about it beyond some sort of like a public pressure, right? And I think years ago that was a choice not to trademark that term, right? Kind of make it available for everybody, and that is also that makes it much easier to make it corrupt, right? Because I was always making this comparison in US, right? There is organic foods. I don't maybe know what those are, right? What are the requirements for those things, but there is some definition which is behind that, and I cannot choose something organic just because it's a product of organic chemistry, right? And that makes sense for me.
Yeah, I mean, it's a social movement at this point. I think the brand is much closer to something like a political party, which has some sort of vague memberships and planks, than to a more traditional commercial mark, right?
Yeah, I mean, and also, like, you can't really imagine OSI, like, suing Facebook. I mean, you can imagine them doing it, but I'm not sure I can imagine them being successful.
I mean, one of the sad realities of the current moment in terms of funding is that OSI is now better funded and better staffed than it ever has been, but including to do some media work. But sadly, that media work in particular, OSI was never going to run around suing people. I don't think I think the trademark discussion that does flare up every few years is sort of a distraction. But you can imagine an OSI that was better funded to have like a part-time press person who ran around talking to the media, right? I think that's a alternative history that we'll always have to wonder about. I did see that there was somebody in the audience raising a hand. I don't know if we can get a mic to them. Oh, okay, all right. Well then, project, Sal.
Can I borrow it and get it?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Thank you. And then get it to you.
Yeah, I think you were getting to a really, really core point that I really wanted to get your perspectives on, because I don't think that understanding the OSI definitions or why you need a license on your code, that's something we can teach developers. But for this moment in time, it's about the regulatory aspect of this, right? So you're having players trying to engage and trying to hold and own and move around the way that the perception of open source is perceived by specifically international regulators. Can you speak a little bit more to how it's being used as a political device?
That's a great question. So for those who aren't super up to date on what's happening in the EU regulatory situation, first a very quick overview. Very cool in a number of recent EU regulations, as well as in a few things in the US, though as I said this morning, don't expect anything for the next 4 years from there. Open source software included in references in the law. We have a pretty clear idea of what that is. They worked with the OSI to make sure that some of this stuff made sense. The EU, as best as I can tell, then said, oh, well, that's cool. So we'll just, in the AI Act, we'll also have a carve out for free and open source AI. And then they were like, cool, you all know what that is, right? And we were like, not really? Okay, we'll figure it out, now. And this was part of why the open source AI definition that the OSI put together last year was a thing that sort of had to be rushed. Like honestly, part of my concern with the definition, with the process, was that it felt fast, it felt premature because we don't know yet what all this stuff means. But unfortunately, there is a ticking regulatory clock that says the EU needs a definition, and if we as a community left a vacuum, then Meta and others were going to fill it, right? And so we had to have a definition. And long story short, I mean, you can find me over drinks later at the booth crawl, like, because I will talk your ear off about this, but like, long story short, that vacuum that was created, I think with good intent by the European Commission, had to be filled, and we had to rush to fill it because otherwise other entities who were not well-intentioned were going to fill it, and we're going to have exactly the same dynamics around AI that we've been talking about with bad actors. Like, there's some good actors who are just sad, like, yeah, I couldn't quite make open source work. There are plenty of actors right now who, because of the brand equity and the regulatory implications, want to change the definition, and that's terrible.
I don't really have anything to add. I think that was a really good summary of some of the challenges in terms of regulations. And I think it does put us at an interesting moment where open source is starting to be part of regulatory discussions, which was not the case previously. And I think it's probably an open question, like, is this a good thing or is it not a good thing? I think there's probably arguments on each side.
I'll be talking about that some in my talk at 5 something in this very room. So if you want to hear more about that, please do come by. I was going to say one other thing about that regulatory moment, but it has slipped my mind. Peter, were you going to say something?
Yeah, well, I want maybe to add to or continue on the topic of definition and where it goes. I think it's interesting what regulations are happening. Right, and I do understand what the OSI can't cover it all, but I think what we need more open source definition evolving beyond the license, right? Because if you think about the practical accessibility of open source, it goes beyond the license, right? Well, governance is, for example, very important, right? Because, well, we know if it's a single corporation, they can, change a license like that, right? When we also have seen some games, companies like Red Hat Play say, well, we are not quite going to violate the GPL, but we are going to find kind of a sneaky way so you can't really use that so-called open source software without actually paying us, while still we want to still call it open source, right? So I think that is a problem, right? And because there's kind of so much money in the open source space right now, right, and it is growing, there will be a lot of the creativity in a bad sense, right? How to exactly, whitewash it, right? Or pretend it isn't good for you open source, but actually it is just good for us in ability to squeeze the maximum amount of money from you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And this is a huge issue in a lot of open source companies. Like, is this open source companies and also open source in general, backed by corporations. So I said earlier, like, I think of open source more as a binary, and this is one of the challenges with the word open source. Like, does it have a license that's approved by OSI? Yes, okay, it's open source. But does it follow not just the letter, but also the intent of what we mean when we say open source? Is there a genuine engagement with community? Is there contributions that come from outside of the maintainer company, and contributions even in the sense of like people asking questions, people answering other people's questions, not even just code. And I think that this is a really good idea to have something that goes beyond just this binary of yes, legally speaking, this is an open source project, and sort of have a better vocabulary for talking about the different ways these communities can function, so that something that's like open source legally but for all intents and purposes, it's really just a small team building a piece of software. But yes, you can see the code, and something that's genuinely a community effort with a huge number of contributors, that there's some vocabulary to talk about that difference.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great set of observations by both of you, and boy, this stuff is just so hard, right? The little known fact, the open source initiative originally planned to evaluate some of these kinds of community behaviors, right? Like, are you actually doing things on open mailing lists, things like that? And that first swell of, like, right around as they were coining the phrase, the number of things that became open source within a matter of weeks and months and that first year overwhelmed the ability of OSI to evaluate that kind of stuff. So they were like, you know what? Now we just evaluate a license, which was a very reasonable thing under the circumstances at the time. But it ended us up in this situation where here we are 25 years later, and back to the regulatory question, the EU, part of why, for those of you who are here this morning, at my first panel, I mentioned that the EU wanted to make the same rules for everybody, and that was in part because they saw open source as essentially a way for American companies to escape regulation, right? Like, Android is, in a license sense, perhaps the most well-documentedly, perfectly open thing that there is, right? Like, it's all machine readable. All the licenses are exactly as you want them. Good luck getting a patch into that, right? Good luck figuring out even when the next release is. And that, is something that would have absolutely failed the original intent of OSI a bazillion years ago, but also OSI could never have conceived, I don't think, of attempting to, in essence, tell one of the most powerful corporations in the history of the world, yeah, like, I know you followed the letter, but not so much the spirit, right? Like, that's a really hard problem, and OSI was not historically able to do it, leaving a vacuum that now, all this time later, the EU had to create this definition of open source stewards to be like, oh, well, the stewards are the ones doing it right, and Android and, pick your poison of other projects are doing it wrong. And the EU had to do that line drawing because we didn't want to do it ourselves.
And this also goes back to the juxtaposition between the type of maintainers that Tidelift was trying to work with, and that Tidelift is working with, and a lot of the companies that worked, and the Googles and Facebooks of the world. What's reasonable to expect of a single maintainer who's started a project to scratch an itch and then all of a sudden saw it explode is not the same as what's reasonable to expect from a huge corporation. And the only thing that those two projects might have in common is their license. And so how do we realistically talk about those situations and even create regulations that are going to be fair to both of those parties? I think that's actually a really hard question. And one of the things that I think is interesting, I'm just going to continue, sorry, about the single maintainer problem is that you can give them money, but ultimately there's a lot of people who just do not want to be entrepreneurs. Or entrepreneurs or even self-employed in any way. That's not what they want to do with their life. I think it takes a specific type of person to want to live that kind of life. And so I think that's also as a space that we need to figure out a little bit more is the solution to a single maintainer project that's become important isn't, I think, necessarily let's allow that person to make it their full-time job because like it or not, that makes them into a self-employed person, and they really might not be comfortable in that situation. So we have to be creative to think about other alternatives.
I want to push back on that myth, really, really hard. The number of people who we talk to at Tidelift, they have been thrust into that situation. If you have your project used by hundreds and hundreds of billion-dollar companies, you are keenly aware that there's a lot of money floating around. And almost universally, when we offered to pay people, they were like, yes, please. So I do agree that not everybody's an entrepreneur. Not everybody wants to like be, so among other things in the U.S., there's all kinds of things around healthcare, for example. But by and large, people are very happy to take the money. The other thing that I was first raising my hand about, though, is that I think this solo maintainer thing pushes hard on that intuition about what we think the spirit of open is and what open actually is, because we all like to talk about, community engagement and the median number of maintainers and contributors always has been, almost certainly always will be 1. Right? So like we keep saying, it's big communities, and that's all lovely. I've spent my whole life in those big communities. I want them to continue. But like also the lived reality of people, and this I think gets in part to the money thing, is like if you gave people a choice between community and money, I think many of them would take community, but the actual choice is between being a lonely accidental part of the supply chain. As somebody said on Mastodon the other day that I thought was brilliant, like open source maintainers are in the supply chain in much the same way a piece of coal is in the supply chain. You're just sort of ground up and you have very little choice in the matter, right? And so I think if that's your choice and you can at least get a check out of it, it turns out most people will actually happily take a check.
Well, I think what I see as a problem here, right, is this kind of like a lot of maybe pushback and self-imposed limitations by maintainers, right? In my opinion, as a maintainer, where people may be expecting something from you, right, but you didn't sign the contract with them, you don't owe them anything. If you are somebody who doesn't feel like contributing to that project anymore, that is your choice. You can leave, right? And I think that is very important to realize that both for ecosystem health as for mental health for many people. The second thing I would say with an open source single maintainer project, the problem is, people die, people go crazy, right? Other things happen to people, right? And I think for us people in the supply chain, we need to think from a higher up, like what is that kind of plan B? Right, if that person cannot maintain that project anymore, right, and maybe kind of work with organizations which can at least some way provide that. For example, if you are signed up with many like Linux distribution vendors, hey, we are promising we have security patch things out of our ecosystem. To what extent they can do that or not, right? But at least there is, some form of that where you do not have to take that kind of risk on.
We need retirement homes for open source projects. That's one of the things I would, now that Tidelift is part of a larger company, that's one of the things I really want to work on in coming years, because I do think, it's scary. Some of the software we're using now is going to be generational in the sense of like, some of the stuff that we're doing now is going to be inside software systems in 100 years, right? And we are really struggling to provide continuity for 5 years or 10 years, but that software is going to literally outlive us, and we are so unprepared as a society to even like ponder that, which is I was about to say a little scary. It's a lot scary.
Before we wrap up, is there anyone else with a question? Go ahead.
That's a good panel topic. I do want to jump back to, I think what we missed here, I think when I'm talking to solo maintainers, and unfortunately many times I'm talking to them when I need them to security patch, so they do not like seeing me coming. I think when we're talking about the exchange of money, what maintainers are considering is that they're taking on liability, and we're ignoring the fact that it's not like you get them into a stewarded situation and then they do feature development still. Then they have public requirements now on real-time response to security patching that they're then given no support for. That's something that I think we do need to take much more seriously, Because that's the thing that I'm seeing take people out of maintaining the projects that they care about.
Somewhat surprisingly, I was pleased to find that the Cyber Resilience Act actually has almost a built-in loophole to help with some of that problem. It's actually pretty creative. I'll be writing about it a little more soon because I didn't even know about it until Friday, and it's like, if it's not my job on this planet, it's nobody's. But I agree with you, right? We are entering a world of more liability and risk for these things. I mean, I think, maybe a bit of a spoiler for my afternoon talk and to your earlier comment about is this good or bad? I think looking at the liability stuff in terms of like good or bad is sort of beside the point. It's much more like there has never been an industry this important to like the human civilizational endeavor that has not been regulated, right? And so the question is not like, is this a good or a bad idea? The question is, we have moved out of the first phase of the life of this industry. And the question is, how do we manage that transition? And that's not about a like moral judgment. To some extent, not even that much of a. We love to talk about philosophy in this movement, and like this is not a philosophical question. This is like cars and pacemakers and all this stuff depends on what we do, including, to your point, security updates. And so we're just gonna have to figure out what that looks like, and that's I've got ideas, but it's not gonna be easy, it's not gonna be quick.
One thing I would say I think is very cool in open source, right, is we have this right to fork and right to branch. So in my opinion, it is perfectly fine to say, hey, I am developer, I like this kind of innovation stuff, I'm going to work on the new features. That is what excites me, right? Maybe I'm not going to spend so much time security fixing, right, or bug fixing in general. Well, if there is some other people who actually choose this project to depend on, well, they can take that stuff on them, right? And even if the developer doesn't want to review their patches and include them, well, there could be some other fork exist. And we have seen, for example, in Linux kernel, right? For years, you would have certain things which would exist in, Red Hat or, Ubuntu, right? And then only later make it in the kernel because they needed certain things for their customers which their community didn't want to accept at that point.
And then I think there's both the regulatory angle, so single maintainers could be obligated to do things that they're not really prepared to promise. There can also be simply the fact, I could maybe call it entitlement, like people in the community could, even absent any sort of regulatory framework, can put a huge amount of pressure on maintainers to do things, whether it's security patches or building a feature or whatever, fixing bugs. That and this is an issue in the community of people who, it's a small portion, but it can be very painful for maintainers. So I think that's another thing, another problem. I don't know how to solve it, just that it's worth mentioning that it exists.
But Emily, I think there's something important here, right? And this is kind of what I guess maybe kind of freaks me out here, right? It's like, oh, you guys will have to do this like security. Well, guys, there is such a thing as a civil disobedience, right? If we, as an open source community, refuse to follow certain things, hey guys, you know what? I'm not doing this fucking thing, right? I'm going to write the code the way I like it, right? In this case, hey, you want what? Or you want to jail me? Go for it, right? Governments are not going to be able to do it, right? I think we have seen in so many countries, so many actions done where people rise up to the kind of stupidity of a government and make changes, right? So I think we should not get that stuff. Oh, government passed out the law, so now we have to all kind of bend backwards and whatever do it. Well, that is only one of the choices.
Yeah, I mean, and also, like, as a maintainer, you can also tell some asshole in your community to go fuck themselves. But, like, a lot of people don't want to do that for whatever reason. And, again, it's one of the things. Just because you're an open source maintainer doesn't mean that you're an expert in managing a community, or like just because you're you are able to write code doesn't mean that you're an expert in managing community dynamics. So yeah, and it goes back to the idea of what is an open source project? I mean, like, does it just mean that you have some software on GitHub, or does it also include all these sort of all these fuzzy things like community management? I think we need to stop pretty soon, so I think we're gonna leave it there. Thank you so much for listening to us chat, and check out Lewis's talk later today.
Yeah, 5 something. Yeah. And if you get me drunk enough, I'll talk about the "fuck you, pay me" public. And if you get me drunk enough, I'll talk about the "fuck you, pay me" public license that is in draft but top secret.
Oh, that's wonderful.